Montana Territory, 1883. The harsh wind swept across the open range, bending the tall pines that bordered the vast expanse of the Davis cattle ranch. Dust swirled in miniature tornadoes along the worn trail as Declan Davis urged his chestnut gelding toward home. At 25, he'd already seen enough of life to know that the frontier was no place for softness. The land took more than it gave, and those who survived were the ones who kept their emotions buried deep, like the roots of prairie grass that weathered every storm. Declan had spent the last 3 years building his modest ranch after inheriting a small plot from a distant uncle. Every callus on his hands told a story of hard work and solitude. Every scar on his sun-bronzed skin marked another lesson learned about survival in the unforgiving West. He'd seen men lose everything to drought, to rustlers, to misplaced trust. The frontier was no place for dreamers or for those who opened their hearts too freely. "A man stands alone out here," his father had told him before consumption took him 2 winters past. "The moment you let someone matter, you give this land something to take from you." Those words had become Declan's creed. He'd built his ranch, managed his small herd, and kept to himself. He traded with the townsfolk of Pine Creek when necessary, but never lingered for social calls. The young women who batted their eyelashes at him during church socials received nothing more than a polite tip of his hat before he would retreat to the isolation of his land. Loneliness sometimes crept in during the long winter nights when the wind howled through the cracks of his cabin walls, but he'd trained himself to see it as the price of independence. Better lonely than broken. Better alone than vulnerable to loss. As he rode along the northern boundary of his property where the pines grew thick, Declan noticed something unusual, a flash of blue fabric among the trees. He reined in his horse, narrowing his eyes against the setting sun. It could be nothing. A scrap of cloth caught on branches, perhaps, but something in his gut told him to investigate. "Come on, Thunder," he murmured to his horse, turning off the trail and into the dense forest. The gelding picked his way carefully through the underbrush, pine needles cushioning his hoofbeats. What Declan found among the trees stopped his breath cold. A young woman lay crumpled at the base of a large pine, her blue dress torn and dirty, her blonde hair falling in tangles around her pale face. For a terrible moment he thought she might be dead, but then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest. Dismounting quickly, Declan knelt beside her. She was beautiful, despite the dirt and scratches on her face, and young, perhaps 20 at most. Her hands were delicate, not worked rough like those of most frontier women. Her blue dress, though now soiled, was clearly of fine quality. "Miss," he called, gently touching her shoulder.
"Miss, can you hear me?"
She didn't respond, but a soft moan escaped her lips. Declan looked around, searching for any sign of how she'd come to be here. There was no horse nearby, no traveling trunk or valise. Just this mysterious young woman, alone and unconscious in his pine forest as night approached. The practical part of Declan's mind, the part that had kept him alive and independent, told him this was trouble. Unknown women didn't just appear in the wilderness without bringing complications. But he couldn't leave her to the mercy of the night, when temperatures would drop and predators would prowl. With a sigh that carried the weight of his reluctance, Declan gathered the unconscious woman in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and her head lolled against his chest as he stood. For a brief moment, something unfamiliar stirred in him, a protective instinct that went beyond basic human decency. "Damn it all," he muttered, carrying her to Thunder. With careful maneuvering, he managed to mount while holding her secure against him. As they rode toward his cabin, Declan couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully ordered life had just been upended, and that the woman in his arms would be the cause of it. The cabin stood alone against the backdrop of mountains, simple but sturdy, built by Declan's own hands. He carried the unconscious woman inside and laid her gently on his bed, the only proper place for an injured lady, though it meant he'd be sleeping on the floor. He lit the oil lamp and stoked the fire, bringing warmth to the room as evening descended. In the better light he could see her more clearly. Her face was heart-shaped, with delicate features and full lips now parched from exposure. Her golden blonde hair would probably shine like summer wheat when clean. Despite her disheveled state, there was a refined quality about her that spoke of Eastern upbringing, of city life, not the hardscrabble existence of the frontier. Declan dampened a clean cloth and gently wiped the dirt from her face, revealing a small cut on her forehead. He cleaned it carefully, then checked her for other injuries, maintaining as much propriety as the situation allowed. Finding no broken bones or serious wounds, he covered her with a quilt and prepared a simple broth, hoping she would wake soon with an explanation that would allow him to return her wherever she belonged, and go back to his solitary life. Hours passed. Declan sat in the wooden chair by the fire, alternating between watching the mysterious woman and staring into the flames. Night had fully descended when she finally stirred, a small whimper escaping her lips as her eyelids fluttered open. The moment her eyes, a striking shade of blue, focused on him, she gasped and tried to scramble away, pressing herself against the wall beside the bed. "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse but cultured, confirming his suspicions about her background. "Where am I?" Declan raised his hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. "My name is Declan Davis. This is my ranch about 15 miles outside Pine Creek. I found you unconscious in the woods and brought you here to recover." He kept his distance, not wanting to frighten her further.
You're safe, miss.
The woman clutched the quilt to her chest, eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for escape or confirmation of his words. "What's your name?" Declan asked gently. "And how did you come to be alone in the woods?" Her face crumpled suddenly, and to his alarm she burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. Declan froze, utterly unprepared for this response. Comfort had never been his strong suit, and the emotional display before him was more terrifying than facing down a mountain lion. I don't," she sobbed, words failing between gasps. Declan remained rooted to his chair, uncertain what to do. Finally, when her sobs had softened to hiccuping breaths, he stood and poured her a cup of water from the pitcher on his small table. "Here," he said, approaching cautiously and offering the cup. "Small sips." She took it with trembling hands, avoiding his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered after drinking. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked again, more gently this time. A long moment passed before she answered, her voice barely audible. Lillian Anderson." "Miss Anderson," Declan acknowledged with a slight nod. "Are you hungry? I've made some broth." She nodded and he brought her a bowl, which she accepted with murmured thanks. As she ate slowly, Declan noticed her glancing repeatedly at the door and windows, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. "Miss Anderson," he said carefully, "I don't mean to press you, but I need to know if someone harmed you."
If there's danger, I should be aware of it.
Lillian set the half-empty bowl aside, her hands twisting in the quilt. "I was running away," she finally admitted. "My carriage, there was an accident near the pass, the driver," her voice broke. "He didn't survive. I wandered trying to find help, but I became lost in the forest. That's all I remember until waking here." Declan frowned, something in her story felt incomplete, but the genuine fear in her eyes stopped him from pressing further. "I'll ride out at first light to look for the carriage and take care of matters," he said solemnly. "Then I can take you to town. There's a small hotel where you can stay until arrangements can be made for your return home." At the mention of returning home, Lillian's face drained of color, and she shook her head violently. "No, I mean I can't go back, please." The desperation in her voice struck something in Declan, despite his resolution to remain detached. "Miss Anderson, whatever trouble you're in." "You don't understand," she cut in, her blue eyes welling with tears again. "If I go back, I'll die." The stark declaration hung in the air between them. Declan studied her face, looking for signs of hysteria or delusion, but found only raw fear and exhaustion. "Rest now," he said finally, deciding that questions could wait until morning. "You're safe here tonight. We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." Relief washed over her features. "Thank you, Mr.
Davis.
Declan," he corrected automatically, surprising himself. He rarely invited such familiarity. "Declan," she repeated softly, as if testing the name on her tongue. He nodded awkwardly and moved to make a pallet for himself near the fire. "Get some sleep, Miss Anderson. Dawn comes early out here." "Lillian," she offered in return. "Please call me Lillian." As Declan settled onto his makeshift bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that finding Lillian Anderson in his pine forest had set something in motion that he couldn't control, something that threatened the careful isolation he'd built around himself. The frontier had just thrown him a challenge unlike any he'd faced before, and he wasn't at all certain he was prepared for it. Morning arrived with thin light filtering through the cabin's single window. Declan had risen before dawn, as was his habit, quietly performing his essential chores while Lillian slept. When he returned from feeding the livestock, he found her awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. "Good morning," she said softly. Declan nodded, suddenly aware of the oddness of having another person in his space, especially a young, beautiful woman. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you." She pushed her tangled blonde hair back from her face. though I'm afraid I'm quite a sight. I've seen worse, he replied honestly, then flushed slightly at his own bluntness. I mean. To his surprise, Lillian laughed, a bright, genuine sound that seemed to lighten the cabin. I imagine you have out here in the wilderness. Declan busied himself preparing a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. I need to tend to my cattle, then I'll ride out to find your carriage, he said, keeping his back to her as he worked. You should rest more. I've imposed enough, Lillian protested. Please let me help somehow. Declan turned to assess her. Though her color was better, she still looked fragile, and her fine dress, even torn and dirty, was hardly suited for ranch work. There's clean water in the basin if you'd like to wash, he offered instead. And I might have a shirt and trousers that would be more comfortable than your dress, though they'll be far too large. Gratitude shone in her eyes. That would be wonderful. Thank you. After an awkward breakfast during which Declan struggled with the unfamiliar task of making conversation, he left Lillian to wash and change while he rode out to check his small herd. The spring calves were growing well, and the grazing was good after recent rains. It was the kind of morning that usually brought him satisfaction, the tangible results of his hard work spread before him. Yet today, his thoughts kept straying back to the cabin and its unexpected occupant. Lillian Anderson was a mystery, and mysteries were dangerous distractions in a place where attention to the land could mean the difference between survival and ruin. When he returned to the cabin, Declan nearly didn't recognize her. Lillian had washed her hair and braided it, the golden strands now shining in the midday light. She wore his spare shirt tucked into trousers that she'd rolled up multiple times at the ankles and cinched with a length of rope at her narrow waist. She'd managed to clean her blue dress as well, which now hung over the back of a chair near the fire to dry. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the clothes. I did my best to make them fit. They suit you well enough, he replied, though suit was hardly the word. Despite the ill-fitting men's clothing, she looked impossibly lovely and completely out of place in his rough cabin. I should go find your carriage, he said, more gruffly than intended. Can you direct me to where the accident occurred? Lillian described the location as best she could, mentioning landmarks that allowed Declan to guess where she might have been. He nodded, gathered supplies, and prepared to leave. I'll be back before dark, he promised. The door has a good bolt, keep it locked while I'm gone. Lillian's eyes widened slightly. Do you expect trouble? Declan hesitated. No, but caution is how we survive out here. The rifle is loaded if you need it. He pointed to where it rested above the door. I've never fired a gun, she admitted. Let's hope you won't need to today. With a nod, Declan left, mounting Thunder and heading toward the mountain pass where Lillian's carriage had reportedly crashed. It took nearly 2 hours to find the site. The carriage lay on its side in a ravine, one wheel completely shattered. The horses were gone, either dead or run off. And as Lillian had said, the driver had not survived the accident. Declan respectfully covered the man's body with a blanket from his saddlebags, making a mental note of where to direct the undertaker from Pine Creek. But as he searched the wreckage for Lillian's belongings, something caught his eye. Partially hidden under the overturned carriage was a man's hat, not a driver's cap, but a fine bowler that had no business being there if Lillian had been traveling alone. Frowning, Declan continued his search. He found a small valise that must have belonged to Lillian, containing a few personal items and a change of clothes. More troubling was what he found inside a hidden compartment of the carriage, a gentleman's coat with a torn sleeve, and more concerning, dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood. Declan's mind raced. Lillian had mentioned only the driver, not a male companion. Either she had deliberately omitted this information or she didn't know about the second man. Neither possibility boded well. With the valise secured to his saddle and a grim suspicion forming in his mind, Declan headed back to the ranch. The mystery surrounding Lillian Anderson had just deepened, and his instinct for self-preservation was screaming at him to take her to town immediately and wash his hands of the whole affair. Yet something stronger held him back, perhaps the genuine fear he'd seen in her eyes, or the way she'd said, "If I go back, I'll die." Whatever trouble Lillian was in, Declan couldn't shake the feeling that she needed protection far more than she needed questions. When he returned to the cabin, he found Lillian outside, hanging laundry on the line he rarely used. She'd washed his spare sheets and some of his clothes alongside her blue dress. The domestic scene struck him oddly, like a painting of someone else's life superimposed on his solitary existence. You didn't have to do that, he said as he dismounted. Lillian turned, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun. It was the least I could do to thank you. Her smile faded as she took in his serious expression. Did you find the carriage? Declan nodded, retrieving her valise from his saddle. And this. I'm afraid many of your things may have been damaged in the crash. Gratitude flooded her face as she accepted the valise. Thank you, I never expected to see these again. The driver didn't make it, Declan confirmed. I'll ride to town tomorrow to notify the proper authorities. Lillian nodded solemnly. He was a good man, his name was Howard. Declan watched her carefully as he asked, was there anyone else traveling with you, Lillian? Her hand stilled on the valise clasp, and though she tried to hide it, he caught the flash of panic in her eyes. No, she said too quickly, just Howard and myself. It was a lie and they both knew it. Declan decided not to press not yet. I should get these inside, Lillian said, clutching the valise to her chest and hurrying toward the cabin. Declan let her go, taking his time unsaddling Thunder and attending to the horse before following her inside. He found her sitting at the table, having changed back into her now clean blue dress. The borrowed clothes were folded neatly on the chair beside her. I made stew, she said, nodding toward the pot hanging over the fire. I hope you don't mind. I found vegetables in your garden plot. Thank you, Declan replied, somewhat thrown by her attempt at normalcy after the moment of tension outside. He washed up, then joined her at the table. They ate in silence for a while before Lillian spoke again. Your ranch is lovely, small but well tended. Declan nodded. It's enough for one man. Have you always lived alone? She asked softly. Since my father died 2 years ago, he answered. Before that we worked this land together. And your mother? Lost her when I was 12, frontier fever. The words came out more clipped than he intended, old pain surfacing despite the years. Lillian's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry, I lost my mother young as well. It leaves a hole that never quite fills, doesn't it? The simple understanding in her voice caught Declan off guard. He found himself nodding, unable to form words for the truth she'd spoken so plainly. What about your father? He asked, turning the conversation away from himself. Lillian's face changed, a shadow crossing her features. My father is a powerful man in Chicago, a banker with political aspirations. Declan waited for her to continue, but she merely pushed her stew around her bowl, lost in thought. Lillian, he said finally, I found evidence that someone else was in that carriage. A man's hat and coat, there was blood. Her spoon clattered against the bowl as her hand began to tremble. I'm not asking to pry, Declan continued gently. But if there's trouble following you, I need to know what, or who might come looking. Tears welled in her eyes. She blinked them away and took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. His name is Victor Caldwell, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My father's business partner and the man I was being forced to marry. The words hung in the air between them. Declan waited, giving her space to continue. Victor is 30 years older than me and has buried 2 wives already, Lillian went on, her voice growing stronger with each word, as if unburdening herself gave her strength. My father owed him money, a great deal of money. I was to be payment of that debt. Declan's jaw tightened. He'd heard of such arrangements in the East, but the naked commerce of it still angered him. I refused, Lillian continued. So they, my father and Victor, arranged to have me sent to Victor's estate in San Francisco, where the wedding would proceed without scandal. Howard was paid to transport me, her hands twisted in her lap. But Howard was kind. When I told him I'd rather die than marry Victor, he agreed to help me escape. And Caldwell was following you, Declan guessed. Lillian nodded. He caught up to us near the pass. There was a struggle. Howard tried to protect me, but Victor, her voice broke. Victor shot him, the horses panicked, the carriage went off the road. Her eyes met Declan's, filled with pain and guilt. It's my fault Howard died. No, Declan said firmly. The man who pulled the trigger is responsible, not you. Victor fell from the carriage during the crash, Lillian continued. I saw him lying motionless on the ground. I hoped he was dead. I ran into the forest, trying to get as far away as possible. Then I became lost and eventually collapsed where you found me. The story explained much, but Declan's unease grew. If Caldwell had survived, he would be searching for Lillian. And if he was the type of man who would kill a driver for helping her escape, he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone else who stood in his way. We need to report this to the sheriff in Pine Creek, Declan said. Fear flashed across Lillian's face. No, Victor has connections everywhere. Money buys loyalty even from lawmen. If word gets out where I am, he'll find me, or my father will send someone else.
Lillian,
Please, she interrupted, reaching across the table to grasp his hand. Her touch was warm, her fingers delicate against his calloused palm. Please don't make me go back, not yet. I just need time to figure out what to do, where to go, somewhere they can't find me. Declan looked down at their joined hands, aware he should pull away but unable to do so. The contact felt both foreign and oddly right. He'd spent so long avoiding entanglements, convinced that the frontier was no place for softness. Yet here was this woman asking him to protect her, and something in him wanted desperately to say yes. 2 days, he said finally, meeting her eyes. You can stay here for 2 days while I make inquiries in town. If Caldwell is alive and searching for you, we need to know. If he died in that crash, we need to know that too. Relief washed over Lillian's face. Thank you, she whispered, squeezing his hand before releasing it. Declan stood abruptly, needing distance from the unfamiliar emotions stirring within him. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, you take the cabin. That's not necessary, she began. It is, he cut her off more sharply than intended. Softening his tone, he added, it's the proper thing to do. As he gathered a blanket and headed for the door, Lillian called after him, Declan. He paused, looking back at her. Why are you helping me? You could have left me in town. You don't know me. It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself since finding her in the pines. The truth was, he didn't have a rational answer. Get some rest, Lillian, he said instead of answering. Tomorrow will come early. As Declan settled into the hay of his barn, listening to the familiar sounds of night on the ranch, he couldn't escape the realization that his carefully constructed isolation had been breached. Lillian Anderson had walked into his life, or rather had been carried in his arms, and in just one day had made his cabin feel different, made him feel different. Fool, he muttered to himself in the darkness. Caring for others on the frontier only led to pain. His father had been right about that. The wilderness took what you loved, and Declan had long ago decided not to give it the chance. Yet as he drifted toward sleep, it was Lillian's face he saw, her grateful smile, her quiet strength, her vulnerability. And despite every hard-learned lesson, he knew he would protect her, whatever the cost. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Declan rose early to complete his chores before the ride to Pine Creek. When he entered the cabin, he found Lillian had prepared breakfast and was dressed in a simple brown skirt and white blouse from her valise, clothes far more practical than her blue dress, though still marking her as someone not from frontier stock. I thought I might help with some chores while you're gone, she said. I noticed your vegetable garden could use weeding and there's mending to be done. Declan's initial instinct was to refuse. His space, his things, his routine, all had been carefully arranged to need only him, but the earnestness in her expression stopped his refusal. If you'd like, he conceded, but don't overtax yourself. You're still recovering. I'm stronger than I look, she replied with a small smile. After breakfast, Declan prepared to leave. Keep the rifle close, he instructed. I should be back by mid-afternoon. Lillian nodded, a shadow of fear crossing her face. Be careful in town, if Victor is alive and looking for me. I know how to be discreet, Declan assured her. I'll simply be a rancher in town for supplies who happen to hear about a carriage accident. As he mounted Thunder, Declan found himself reluctant to leave. The urge to stay and protect Lillian was surprisingly strong, an unfamiliar feeling that left him unbalanced. With a final nod in her direction, he turned his horse toward town, trying to ignore the strange sense that he was leaving something valuable unguarded. Pine Creek was a small but growing settlement, boasting a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and various other establishments necessary for frontier life. Sheriff Morgan kept order with a firm but fair hand, and Declan respected the older man's judgment. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where he found Morgan reading through wanted posters at his desk. Davis, the sheriff greeted him with surprise. Don't often see you in town unless it's supply day. Came across something concerning, Declan replied, taking a seat. Found a wrecked carriage near Logan's Pass yesterday. Driver dead, looked to be shot before the crash. Sheriff Morgan's expression sharpened. Anyone else? Signs of at least one passenger but no other bodies, Declan answered carefully. Thought you should know. Appreciate that. I'll ride out and take a look. Morgan studied him. Anything else you noticed? Valuables, luggage. Declan shrugged. Nothing out of the ordinary. Seems like a robbery gone bad, maybe. The sheriff nodded slowly, though his shrewd eyes suggested he sensed Declan wasn't telling the whole story. Heard anything about strangers in the area, anyone asking questions or seeming out of place? That's partly why I came, Declan said. Thought I'd ask the same. Morgan leaned back in his chair. Funny you should mention it. Had a city fellow come through yesterday asking about a young woman traveling alone, well-dressed despite trail dust, said he was looking for his fiancée who'd wandered off during their journey. Declan kept his expression neutral despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. That's so, he give a name. Caldwell, Victor Caldwell from Chicago, offered a substantial reward for information, left town heading west but said he'd be back in a few days. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. Any reason that would interest you, Davis? Just curious, Declan replied evenly. Not often we get excitement out here. After a few more minutes of careful conversation, Declan took his leave, heading to the general store for the supplies that would justify his trip to town. His mind raced with the confirmation that Caldwell was alive and searching for Lillian. The man had already killed once to reclaim her. He wouldn't hesitate to do so again. As Declan gathered supplies, he overheard two women discussing the stranger who'd passed through. Such fine manners, one said admiringly, and generous too, left a whole silver dollar as a tip for just a meal and a room. Seemed mighty concerned about finding his fiancée, the other replied. Poor man was beside himself with worry, said she had a nervous condition and wasn't thinking clearly. Well, I hope he finds her before she comes to harm. A delicate city woman wouldn't last long alone out here. Declan's jaw tightened as he paid for his goods. Caldwell was painting Lillian as mentally unstable, a clever tactic that would ensure anyone finding her would turn her over to her concerned fiancé rather than listening to her accusations. By the time Declan headed back to his ranch, his decision was made. Lillian's fears had been justified. She couldn't safely seek help in Pine Creek, and if she returned to Chicago, she'd be forced into marriage with a murderer. For now, the safest place for her was his remote ranch, where Caldwell was unlikely to look. The realization that he was committing to harboring her, at least temporarily, should have troubled him more than it did. Declan had spent years avoiding complications, yet here he was, deliberately stepping into one. But the alternative, sending Lillian back to Caldwell, was unthinkable. When the cabin came into view, Declan was surprised by the relief that washed over him at seeing smoke curling from the chimney. The sight of Lillian hanging laundry on the line, her blonde hair gleaming in the afternoon sun, affected him in ways he wasn't prepared to examine. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, her face breaking into a smile that quickly faded as she read his expression. He's alive, she said. It wasn't a question. Declan dismounted, nodding grimly. And looking for you. He's telling people you're his fiancée who wandered off due to a nervous condition. The color drained from Lillian's face. No one would believe me over him, she whispered. He's respectable, wealthy, I'm just a woman. He left town heading west, Declan told her, but plans to return in a few days. That gives us time to figure out what to do. Us? Lillian looked up at him, hope and uncertainty mingling in her eyes. Declan hadn't meant to say us. The word had slipped out unbidden, yet he couldn't bring himself to take it back. You can stay here until it's safe, he said instead. My ranch is remote enough that he's unlikely to find you. Gratitude washed over Lillian's face, and before Declan could react, she had stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a tight embrace. Thank you, she whispered against his chest. Declan stood frozen, acutely aware of her warmth, the scent of her hair, the trust implicit in her embrace. Awkwardly, he brought one hand up to rest briefly on her back before stepping away. We should get inside, he said gruffly, gathering his saddlebags. I'll need to work out sleeping arrangements if you're staying longer. I don't want to put you out of your home, Lillian protested, following him to the cabin. The barn seemed comfortable enough when I took out fresh water for your horses this morning. Declan raised an eyebrow. You tended the horses. And weeded the garden and mended 3 of your shirts, she added with a small, proud smile. I'm not completely helpless despite my upbringing. I never said you were, Declan replied, somewhat taken aback by her initiative. Inside the cabin, he found things tidier than he'd left them. The floor had been swept, the dishes washed and put away, and something savory simmered in the pot over the fire. Rabbit stew, Lillian explained, following his gaze. An older one was caught in one of your snares. I hope you don't mind that I prepared it. Declan shook his head, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him at the domestic scene. Not at all. As they shared the meal, Declan explained what he'd learned in town, careful to include every detail about Caldwell's search. Lillian listened intently, her expression alternating between fear and determination. "I need to leave the territory," she concluded. "Perhaps go north to Canada or west to Oregon. Somewhere he won't think to look." That would mean traveling alone through wilderness with little money and no frontier experience, Declan pointed out. "It's not safe." Lillian's chin lifted stubbornly. "I managed to escape Chicago and Victor once already. I'm more capable than I appear, Mr. Davis." "Declan," he corrected automatically, "and I don't doubt your courage, just your experience. The wilderness kills the unprepared, regardless of their determination." Their eyes locked across the table, neither willing to back down. Finally, Lillian sighed. "What do you suggest, then?" "I can't stay here forever, hiding in your cabin like a ghost." The thought of her leaving sent an unexpected pang through Declan. "Stay until we have a better plan," he said. "At least until Caldwell gives up searching this area." Lillian studied him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. Taking me and puts you at risk." It was the second time she'd asked, and this time Declan couldn't avoid the question. "My mother used to say that a person's character is revealed by what they do when no one's watching," he said slowly. "I found you alone, injured. Leaving you to fend for yourself or turning you over to a man you fear isn't something I could live with." The simple truth hung between them, more revealing than Declan had intended. Lillian's eyes softened. "Your mother taught you well," she said quietly. That night, despite Lillian's protests, Declan insisted on sleeping in the barn again. As he lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of his ranch, he tried to make sense of the changes one woman had brought to his carefully ordered life in just 2 days. He'd been content in his solitude, or so he'd believed. Yet with Lillian in his cabin, tending his garden and mending his clothes, the ranch felt different, more complete somehow. The realization unsettled him deeply. Attachment was dangerous on the frontier. His father's words echoed in his mind. "The moment you let someone matter, you give this land something to take from you." Declan rolled onto his side, trying to silence the voice. He was simply helping someone in need, nothing more. Once Lillian was safe, she would move on with her life and he would return to his solitude. That was how it had to be. But even as he tried to convince himself, Declan knew something fundamental had shifted. The frontier's harshest lesson, that a man stands alone, no longer felt like absolute truth. And that uncertainty was more frightening than any physical danger he'd faced. The next week passed in a strange new rhythm. Declan continued his ranching duties, while Lillian gradually transformed his barebones cabin into something resembling a home. She proved surprisingly adept at practical matters, learning quickly when he showed her how to work the pump, tend the vegetable garden, and even assist with the more straightforward aspects of caring for the livestock. They fell into an unexpected partnership, working side by side during the day and sharing meals and conversation in the evenings. Declan found himself speaking more than he had in years, drawn out by Lillian's genuine interest and thoughtful questions. He told her about his hopes for the ranch, how he planned to expand his herd, perhaps build a larger cabin someday. She shared stories of her life in Chicago, the stifling expectations, her love of books, her secret desire to become a teacher. "My father thought education was wasted on women," she confided one evening as they sat before the fire. "But my mother encouraged me to learn. She said knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you." "Your mother sounds wise," Declan replied. "She was," Lillian smiled sadly. "I think she would have liked it out here, away from the pretensions of society." "And you?" Declan asked, surprising himself with the question. "Do you like it here?" Lillian gazed around the small cabin that she'd gradually filled with small touches, wildflowers in a jar on the table, a quilt she'd mended draped over the chair, herbs hanging to dry from the rafters. "I do," she said softly. "There's an honesty to this life, no false faces, no hidden agendas, just the land and the work and the sky." Her blue eyes met his, "and good people." The warmth in her gaze sent an unfamiliar sensation through Declan's chest. He looked away, focusing on the fire. "It's a hard life," he said. "The winters are brutal, the work never ends. One bad season can ruin everything you've built." "Yet you choose it," Lillian observed. Declan nodded slowly. "I do." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of connection that both comforted and alarmed Declan. On the 8th day of Lillian's stay, Declan rode to town again, cautiously seeking news. Sheriff Morgan confirmed that Caldwell had returned to Pine Creek, still searching and now offering an even larger reward. "Seems mighty determined to find this woman," Morgan commented. "Says she's his betrothed and in danger without her medicine. You haven't seen any sign of a young woman near your property, have you, Davis?" "No," Declan lied smoothly. "Just cattle and coyotes." The sheriff studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, if you do, you'll let me know. This Caldwell fellow has friends in high places, from what I gather." "I'll keep that in mind," Declan replied, uneasy with the lie but more concerned about Lillian's safety. As he gathered supplies at the general store, he overheard more gossip about Caldwell, who had apparently taken a room at the hotel indefinitely. "He's hired 3 local men to help search," Mrs. Peterson told the storekeeper, "paying them $5 a day each. Says his fiancée needs special care and might hurt herself if left alone." "Mighty devoted," the storekeeper replied. "Though between you and me, I wonder if there's more to the story. Man seems just a touch too smooth, if you take my meaning." Declan lingered, pretending to examine canned goods while listening intently. "What do you mean, Mrs.?" Peterson asked. The storekeeper lowered his voice. "Well, Jim at the saloon says this Caldwell fellow's been drinking heavy at night, and when he's in his cups, he talks about teaching her a lesson when he finds her. Doesn't sound like a concerned fiancé to me." "Well, I never, Mrs." Peterson exclaimed, though her tone suggested more interest than outrage. "You think he might have bad intentions toward the poor girl?" "Can't say for certain," the storekeeper replied. "But I told Sheriff Morgan to keep an eye on him, just in case." Declan completed his purchases and left, troubled by what he'd heard. Caldwell wasn't giving up, and worse, he was hiring local men who knew the territory to help search. It would only be a matter of time before someone thought to check the more remote ranches. By the time he returned home, Declan had made a decision. He found Lillian in the vegetable garden, harvesting beans that she'd carefully tended. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Caldwell is still in Pine Creek. He's hired men to help search for you." Lillian's face paled, but she nodded, following him into the cabin. As they sat at the table, Declan explained everything he'd learned, including the storekeeper's suspicions. "It's not safe for you to stay here much longer," he concluded. "Someone will eventually think to check this ranch." "Where can I go?" Lillian asked, her voice small but steady. "I have little money, and he'll be watching the stagecoach and the train station." Declan took a deep breath. "I have a suggestion, but you may not like it." "I'm listening." "My mother's sister lives in Canada, near Vancouver. She married a shopkeeper there. They're good people and far beyond Caldwell's reach. I could take you there." Hope flickered in Lillian's eyes. "You would do that, travel all that way?" "I would," Declan confirmed, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "We could leave tomorrow, travel north through the mountains. It would mean hard riding, sleeping rough, but we could be there in 2 weeks." "What about your ranch, your cattle?" "My neighbor, old Jim Harker, has been wanting to expand his grazing. I could pay him to watch my herd until I return." Lillian studied him, her expression unreadable. "Why would you do this, Declan? You've already risked enough harboring me." The question hung between them, demanding an answer more honest than Declan had been willing to give himself. The truth was that in just over a week, Lillian Anderson had become important to him in ways he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, offering the simplest version of a more complex truth. Lillian reached across the table, her hand coming to rest on his. "Thank you," she said softly. "I accept your offer, and I promise I'll find a way to repay your kindness someday." Declan turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining in a moment of connection that sent warmth spreading through him. "There's no debt between us," he said quietly. That night, as Declan made preparations for their journey, he found himself facing the realization that his life had irrevocably changed since finding Lillian in the pines. His carefully maintained isolation had been breached, and the walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling. The prospect of taking Lillian to safety brought both relief and a strange sense of loss, because once she was safe with his aunt, he would have no reason to remain with her. The thought troubled him more than it should have. Morning arrived with a heavy fog that shrouded the ranch in ghostly white. Declan saw it as a blessing. The fog would cover their departure, making it harder for any of Caldwell's hired men to spot them leaving. They packed lightly, food, bedrolls, a change of clothes, and the few personal items Lillian had in her valise. Declan saddled Thunder for himself and a gentle mare named Maple for Lillian, who admitted to limited riding experience. "Stay close," he instructed as they mounted. "The fog will make it easy to get separated." Lillian nodded, her face set with determination despite the fear he could see in her eyes. In her brown riding skirt and white blouse, with her golden hair braided beneath a wide-brimmed hat, she looked both vulnerable and resolute, a contradiction that Declan found increasingly captivating. They rode north, keeping to game trails and less traveled paths to avoid encountering others. The fog gradually lifted as the morning progressed, revealing the majestic landscape of mountains and forests stretching before them. Despite the circumstances, Declan felt a curious lightness. The open trail had always represented freedom to him, and sharing it with Lillian brought an unexpected joy. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed as they paused on a ridge overlooking a vast valley. "I've never seen anything like this." "The territory has its charms," Declan agreed, watching her face as she took in the view. The wonder in her expression stirred something in him, a forgotten appreciation for the land he'd come to take for granted. They made good progress that first day, stopping to make camp in a sheltered grove as dusk approached. Declan built a small fire, careful to keep it low to avoid detection, while Lillian prepared a simple meal from their provisions. "You're a natural at this," Declan commented as he watched her confidently tending the cooking pot. Lillian laughed, "Hardly, but I've always been a quick study, and watching you this past week taught me more than years in Chicago ever did." After they ate, they sat side by side near the fire, the night sounds of the wilderness surrounding them. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant against the dark canvas of the sky. "I used to imagine the stars were windows," Lillian said softly, her face tilted upward. "Windows in heaven where those we've lost can look down on us." Declan followed her gaze. "My mother used to say something similar, that the stars were God's way of reminding us we're never truly alone." Lillian turned to him, her face gentle in the firelight. "Is that why you chose to be alone? Because you never felt truly alone with the stars watching over you?" The question caught Declan off guard with its insight. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "I chose solitude because it seemed safer. My father said that the moment you let someone matter, you give this land something to take from you," Lillian finished. At his surprised look, she added, "You've mentioned it before. But Declan, has it occurred to you that your father might have been wrong?" Declan stared into the flames, considering her words. "He lost my mother to frontier fever, nearly broke him." "Yet he kept you close," Lillian observed. "He didn't send you away to protect himself from possibly losing you too." "That was different. I was his son." "Yes, but you mattered to him. You were someone the land could take from him, yet he chose to keep you near because the joy of having you in his life outweighed the fear of losing you." The simple truth of her words struck Declan like a physical blow. His father, for all his warnings about attachment, had never stopped loving him, had never retreated from that connection despite the risk of loss. "I never looked at it that way," he said quietly. Lillian's hand found his in the darkness. "Perhaps the frontier doesn't take what we love to punish us, Declan. Perhaps loss is simply part of living wherever we are. And perhaps what matters is not avoiding attachment, but having the courage to love anyway." The warmth of her hand in his anchored Declan as her words washed over him, challenging beliefs he'd held for years. In the firelight, with the stars overhead and the wilderness around them, he felt something shift inside, a loosening of the rigid protection he'd built around his heart. When they finally settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Declan found sleep elusive. Lillian's words echoed in his mind, along with a growing realization that his feelings for her had moved far beyond simple concern or duty. The admission, even to himself, was terrifying and strangely liberating. The next several days followed a similar pattern. They traveled from dawn until late afternoon, making steady progress northward through increasingly rugged terrain. Each night, they made camp, prepared simple meals, and talked by the fire. Declan found himself sharing stories and thoughts he'd never voiced aloud, drawn out by Lillian's genuine interest and thoughtful responses. In turn, she told him more about her life in Chicago, her restricted upbringing, her father's coldness after her mother's death, her dreams of independence that had been systematically crushed. "I never fit the mold they created for me," she confessed on their fifth night on the trail. "My father said I was too headstrong, too curious, to everything that a proper lady shouldn't be. He was wrong, Declan said with unexpected vehemence. Those qualities are what helped you survive. Lillian's smile in the firelight sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the flames. Thank you for seeing me, she said softly. Not many have bothered to look past what they expected to see. On the 7th day of their journey, as they were crossing a high mountain pass, disaster struck. A sudden summer storm rolled in, bringing lightning and driving rain that quickly turned the trail treacherous. Thunder spooked the horses, and Maple, Lillian's mount, reared suddenly, throwing her to the ground before bolting down the trail. Declan was off Thunder in an instant, rushing to where Lillian lay crumpled on the rocky ground. "Lillian," he called, his heart pounding with fear as he knelt beside her.
Lillian, can you hear me?
To his immense relief, she stirred, groaning softly as her eyes fluttered open. "Declan, what happened?" "Lightning spooked your horse, she threw you." He helped her sit up slowly, checking for injuries.
Are you hurt?
Lillian winced as she moved her right ankle. "My ankle, I think it might be sprained." The rain continued to pour down, soaking them both. Thunder crashed overhead, and Declan knew they needed shelter immediately. Maple was gone, taking some of their supplies with her, but at least Thunder remained, watching them nervously from a few yards away. "We need to find shelter," Declan said, gathering Thunder's reins.
Can you stand if I help you?
With his support, Lillian managed to get to her feet, but she couldn't put weight on her injured ankle. The pain brought tears to her eyes, though she tried to hide them. "I'm sorry," she whispered.
I'm slowing us down.
"Don't apologize," Declan said firmly. "This isn't your fault." Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms, then managed to get her settled on Thunder's back before mounting behind her. With one arm securely around her waist, he guided the horse carefully down the trail, searching for shelter from the relentless storm. They found it in the form of an abandoned trapper's cabin tucked into a stand of pines about a mile from where Lillian had fallen. The cabin was small and somewhat dilapidated, but its roof was mostly intact, providing blessed relief from the rain. Declan helped Lillian inside, settling her on a crude bench while he checked the rest of the cabin. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and though cobwebs filled the corners, the structure was sound enough to provide shelter for the night. "We'll stay here until the storm passes," he decided, returning to where Lillian sat shivering in her wet clothes. "Let me get a fire started, then we'll see to that ankle." Despite the damp conditions, Declan managed to get a small fire going in the fireplace. He brought in their remaining supplies from Thunder's saddlebags, including a change of clothes for each of them. "You need to get out of those wet things," he said, handing Lillian her dry clothing.
I'll step outside while you change.
"Don't be ridiculous," Lillian protested, gesturing to the pouring rain visible through the cabin's single window. "Turn your back."
I'll change quickly.
The practicality of her suggestion couldn't be denied, though the intimacy of the situation made Declan uncomfortable. He turned to face the wall, acutely aware of the soft rustling of fabric as Lillian changed her clothes. "You can turn around now," she said after a few minutes. Declan found her seated on the bench again, dressed in her dry clothes with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her wet garments were spread near the fire to dry.
"Now you," she said firmly, "before you catch a chill."
Following her example, Declan turned his back to change into dry clothing while Lillian looked away. Once they were both warm and dry, he knelt beside her to examine her injured ankle, which had begun to swell. "It's not broken," he concluded after a careful assessment, "but it's a bad sprain. You won't be able to walk on it for a few days at least."
Lillian's face fell. "Declan, I'm so sorry. This changes everything."
"It just means we rest here until you're better," he replied, improvising a cold compress using his dampened bandana. "We have supplies enough for a few days, and I can hunt if necessary." "But what if," Lillian began, then stopped abruptly, her eyes widening as she looked toward the door. Declan turned to follow her gaze and froze. There in the doorway, dripping wet and pointing a revolver directly at them, stood Victor Caldwell. "What a touching scene," Caldwell drawled, his refined accent at odds with the dangerous gleam in his eyes. "The runaway bride and her frontier savior." Declan rose slowly, positioning himself between Lillian and Caldwell. "Put the gun down," he said evenly. "There's no need for that here." Caldwell was exactly as Lillian had described him. Older, expensively dressed despite his bedraggled appearance, with cold eyes and a mouth that seemed perpetually curled in disdain. "I believe I'll keep it right where it is," Caldwell replied. Step aside, cowboy. My fiancé and I have private matters to discuss. I am not your fiancé, Lillian said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear evident on her face. I never agreed to marry you. Your father did, Caldwell sneered, and a daughter's duty is to obey her father. Her father has no right to sell her like cattle, Declan said, anger building in his chest. Caldwell's laugh was cold. That's exactly what women like Lillian are, valuable property to be traded. Her father owes me a considerable sum, and she is payment. It's a simple business arrangement. I'm not property, Lillian said, struggling to her feet despite her injured ankle, and I won't go with you. Caldwell's expression darkened. You have no choice. Your cowboy friend here will step aside if he values his life. He gestured with the revolver. Move now. Declan didn't budge. She's not going anywhere with you. Noble but foolish, Caldwell sighed theatrically. I've already killed once to reclaim what's mine. I won't hesitate to do so again. You murdered Howard, Lillian accused. He was innocent, just trying to help me. He interfered in matters that didn't concern him, Caldwell replied coldly. As is this cowboy, I won't ask again, step aside. The tension in the small cabin was palpable. Declan assessed his options quickly. Caldwell had the advantage with the gun, but Declan was younger, stronger, and had more at stake. If Lillian was returned to this man, she would face a life of misery or worse. Lillian stays with me, Declan stated firmly. Caldwell's face twisted with rage. Then you die first. What happened next occurred in a blur of motion. As Caldwell raised his revolver to take aim, Declan lunged forward, tackling the older man around the waist. They crashed to the floor, the gun discharging into the ceiling as they grappled for control. Caldwell was surprisingly strong for his age, driven by fury and entitlement. He fought dirty, clawing at Declan's eyes, attempting to knee him in the groin. But Declan had the advantage of youth and the driving need to protect Lillian. He managed to pin Caldwell's gun hand to the floor, slamming it repeatedly until the weapon clattered away. Lillian, the gun, Declan shouted as he struggled to subdue the older man. Despite her injured ankle, Lillian hobbled to where the revolver had slid, retrieving it with shaking hands. Caldwell, seeing his advantage lost, redoubled his efforts, landing a solid punch to Declan's jaw that momentarily stunned him. Caldwell shoved Declan aside and scrambled toward Lillian, his face contorted with rage. Give me the gun, you ungrateful little. The revolver discharged with a deafening boom, the sound filling the small cabin. Caldwell stopped mid-sentence, a look of surprise crossing his features as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his expensive shirt. He took one staggering step backward, then collapsed to the floor. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of rain on the roof and their labored breathing. Lillian stood frozen, the smoking gun still in her hands, her face a mask of shock. Declan moved quickly to check Caldwell, confirming what he already suspected. The man was dead, the bullet having struck him directly in the heart. He's gone, Declan said quietly, returning to Lillian. She hadn't moved, her eyes fixed on Caldwell's body, the revolver still clutched in her trembling hands. Gently, Declan took the weapon from her, setting it aside before guiding her to sit on the bench. Lillian, he said softly, kneeling before her, look at me, not at him. Slowly, her eyes focused on his face. I killed him, she whispered. I didn't mean to. You saved my life, Declan told her firmly. He would have killed us both. They'll hang me, Lillian said, her voice hollow. A woman who kills her fiancé, no one will believe it was self-defense. It won't come to that, Declan promised. This was clearly self-defense. He confessed to Howard's murder. He was threatening both of us. But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Declan knew the reality might be more complicated. Victor Caldwell was wealthy and connected. Even in death, his influence could reach far, and Lillian was right. A woman who killed a respected businessman might find little sympathy, regardless of the circumstances. As if reading his thoughts, Lillian shook her head. You know it's not that simple, she said quietly. His family, my father, they'll want revenge. They'll twist the truth. Declan took her cold hands in his mind racing through their options. Then we don't go back, he said decisively. We continue north to Vancouver as planned. Caldwell was traveling alone, tracking us. No one knows he found us. We can bury him deep in these woods where he'll never be found. The words sounded cold, even to his own ears, but Declan knew it was their only chance. If they reported the incident, Lillian would be at the mercy of a justice system that rarely favored women, especially against powerful men like Caldwell. Can we truly leave him here? Lillian asked, her voice small. Just
Disappear.
We can, Declan assured her, and we must if you're to have any chance at freedom. Lillian looked from Caldwell's body to Declan's face, searching his eyes. Whatever she saw there seemed to steady her, and she nodded slowly. All right, she whispered, but we'll have to live with this forever. We will, Declan acknowledged, together. The word hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to fully address. But in that moment, facing death and difficult choices, Declan knew with absolute certainty that he didn't want to return to his solitary existence, that the prospect of facing the future with Lillian at his side was worth any risk. Despite the storm, Declan buried Caldwell that night in a deep grave far from the cabin, marking it only with a cairn of stones that would eventually be reclaimed by the forest. When he returned, soaked and mud-covered, he found Lillian had prepared hot coffee and laid out dry clothes for him. Thank you, he said simply, both for the practical kindness and the deeper acceptance of the hard choice they'd made together. Lillian nodded, her face still pale but her eyes clearer now. What happens next? She asked as he changed behind the privacy of a blanket she'd hung across a corner of the cabin. We wait out the storm, Declan replied, emerging in dry clothing. Rest your ankle for a day or two, then we continue north. With luck, we'll find Maple along the trail with our supplies.
And if we don't?
Then we make do with what we have, he said, sitting beside her near the fire. We're both survivors, Lillian, we'll find a way. She looked at him then, really looked at him as if seeing something new in his face. Yes, she said softly, I believe we will. They remained in the trapper's cabin for 3 days, waiting for Lillian's ankle to heal enough for travel. During that time, something profound shifted between them. The shared secret of Caldwell's death bound them together, yes, but there was something deeper developing, a partnership forged through adversity, a trust built on acceptance of each other's flaws and strengths. On the morning of the 4th day, with the storm long past and Lillian able to walk with only minimal pain, they prepared to continue their journey. We'll have to ride double on thunder, Declan said as he saddled the horse. It will slow us down, but we should still reach Vancouver in about 10 days. Lillian nodded, looking back at the cabin that had been both their prison and their sanctuary. Strange how life changes in an instant, she mused. A week ago I was terrified of my future, now. Now, Declan prompted when she fell silent. She turned to him, the morning sunlight illuminating her face, making her blue eyes shine like the sky after a storm. Now I'm still afraid, but not in the same way. Before I feared a future that was being forced upon me. Now I fear a future I can't fully see, but at least it's mine to choose. Declan stepped closer, drawn by the quiet strength in her words. Our choices define us, he said, not our circumstances. Is that why you chose solitude? Lillian asked. Because it was your choice, not something forced upon you. The question struck at the heart of truths Declan had never fully articulated, even to himself.
Perhaps, he admitted.
My father's warnings about attachment made sense after my mother died, but I think I embraced solitude so completely because it was safer than risking the pain of loss again. And now, Lillian's voice was soft, the question hanging between them like a fragile thing. Declan looked at her, really looked at her. In the short time since he'd found her in the pines, Lillian Anderson had upended everything he thought he knew about himself. She'd challenged his beliefs, shared his dangers, and somehow found her way past the walls he'd so carefully constructed around his heart. Now I'm not so sure isolation is the answer, he said quietly. Some connections might be worth the risk. The words were inadequate for the feelings swelling in his chest, but Lillian seemed to understand what remained unspoken. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I think so too, she whispered, and then with a courage that continually surprised him, she rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question as much as an answer. Declan stood frozen for a heartbeat, then his arms came around her, drawing her closer as he returned the kiss with all the emotion he'd kept buried for so long. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Declan rested his forehead against hers. This changes everything, he murmured. Lillian smiled, her first truly carefree smile since he'd found her. Good, she said simply. Their journey north resumed with a new energy, despite the challenges of riding double and their limited supplies. They found Maple 2 days later, grazing peacefully in a meadow with their packs still miraculously intact. The discovery felt like a sign, the first piece of good fortune in a string of hardships. As they continued toward Vancouver, Declan and Lillian's relationship deepened. The shared trauma of Caldwell's death gradually receded, replaced by conversations about possibilities, about futures neither had dared imagine before. By unspoken agreement, they didn't label what was growing between them, but their increasing touches, shared smiles, and lingering glances spoke volumes. On the 14th day of their journey, they reached Vancouver. The bustling port city was a shock after the isolation of their travels, but Declan guided them confidently through the streets to his aunt's modest home near the harbor. Martha Wilson, his mother's sister, welcomed them with open arms, asking few questions when Declan introduced Lillian simply as a dear friend in need of sanctuary. The older woman's shrewd eyes took in their travel-worn appearance and the way they unconsciously stayed close to each other, but she merely smiled and showed them to separate rooms in her comfortable home. Over the following days, they gradually told Martha a version of the truth, that Lillian had fled an unwanted marriage arrangement and needed to start fresh where her father couldn't find her. The complete story of Caldwell's death remained their secret, a burden they carried together. Martha, practical and kind-hearted, helped Lillian secure a position as an assistant in the local schoolhouse, where her education and gentle manner quickly endeared her to the children and the head teacher. Declan, meanwhile, found himself at a crossroads. His original plan had been to see Lillian safely settled, then return to his ranch in Montana. But as the days passed, the thought of leaving her became increasingly unbearable. "You've been quiet today," Lillian observed one evening as they walked along the harbor, watching the ships come and go in the fading light. 2 weeks in Vancouver had brought color back to her cheeks and a confidence to her step that made Declan's heart ache with pride in something deeper. "I've been thinking," he admitted, "about what comes next." Lillian's step slowed. "You're considering returning to your ranch." It wasn't a question, but Declan answered anyway. "I should, it's my home, my livelihood." "Yes," Lillian agreed softly. "You've worked hard to build it." They walked in silence for a few more steps before Declan stopped, turning to face her. The setting sun painted her golden hair with fire and softened her features, making her appear almost ethereal. "But I've realized something, Lillian," he said, taking her hands in his. "A ranch is just land and buildings. It's not truly a home without someone to share it with." Lillian's blue eyes widened. "Declan, let me finish," he said gently. "My whole life, I believed what my father told me, that caring for someone meant giving the frontier something to take from you. I embraced solitude because it felt safer than risking loss." He took a deep breath, gathering courage for words he'd never imagined himself saying. "But you were right. My father kept me close despite the risk because having me in his life was worth it, and now I understand why." "Why?" Lillian whispered, her eyes never leaving his face. "Because loving someone, truly loving them, makes everything else worthwhile. The risks, the hardships, even the possibility of loss someday." Declan squeezed her hands gently. "I love you, Lillian Anderson. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I found you in those pines." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "I love you too," she said, her voice catching. "I never expected to find this when I fled Chicago, but somehow in losing everything I found what matters most." Declan released her hands only to cup her face gently. "I don't want to return to Montana without you," he said, "but I won't ask you to leave the security you found here unless it's what you truly want." Lillian leaned into his touch. "Security without love is just another kind of cage," she said softly. "I've spent my life in gilded cages, Declan. What I want is freedom, and I've learned that true freedom comes from choosing who to love and how to live, not from hiding from risk." "Then marry me," Declan said, the words emerging with surprising ease. "Come back to Montana with me as my wife. We'll build a life together, a real home." "Yes," Lillian answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their kiss, witnessed only by the setting sun and distant seabirds, sealed a promise that had begun in the pine forest where Declan had first found her. A promise of partnership, of shared burdens and joys, of a love strong enough to weather whatever the frontier might throw at them. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Martha's parlor, with a local minister officiating and Martha as their only witness. Lillian wore a new blue dress, reminiscent of the one she'd worn when Declan found her, and he wore the only suit he owned, purchased specifically for the occasion. As they exchanged vows, Declan found himself thinking of how far they'd come, not just the physical distance from Montana to Vancouver, but the emotional journey from isolation to connection, from fear to love. Their return journey to Montana was easier than their flight north had been. Traveling as husband and wife, with proper provisions and no need for secrecy, they made good time. Lillian's natural adaptability and growing confidence in frontier skills made her an equal partner on the trail, and Declan found himself admiring her resilience more with each passing day. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking Declan's ranch, he reined in his horse, allowing Lillian to take in the view of what would now be her home. "It's not much," he said, suddenly seeing the modest cabin and small herd through her eyes. "Nothing like what you knew in Chicago." Lillian turned to him, her face alight with genuine joy. "It's perfect," she said, "because it's ours." As they rode down to the cabin, Declan felt a sense of completion he'd never experienced before. The ranch that had once been merely a place of work and shelter now felt truly like a home. The solitude he'd once clung to as protection now seemed like the true danger, a slow withering of the spirit that Lillian's presence had reversed. That night, as husband and wife, they lay together in the bed where Lillian had first recovered after being found in the pines. Outside, the stars shone brightly in the vast Montana sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a reminder of the wilderness that surrounded them. "Are you afraid?" Declan asked softly, his arm around her as she nestled against his chest. "Of what?" Lillian murmured. "The frontier, the isolation, the life we've chosen." Lillian propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her blue eyes serious in the moonlight filtering through the window. "I'm not afraid of those things," she said. "The only thing that truly frightened me was a life without choice, without love." She traced his features with gentle fingers. "You found me when I was lost in more ways than one, Declan. You held me until I could speak my truth. And now we've found each other in a deeper way." Declan pulled her close, overwhelmed by the gift of her presence in his life. "My father was wrong," he whispered against her hair. "The frontier doesn't just take. Sometimes, if we're brave enough to risk our hearts, it gives us exactly what we need." Lillian smiled against his chest. "And sometimes, what looks like the harshest wilderness can become the most beautiful home, if we have the right person beside us." As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Declan knew they would face challenges ahead. The frontier was still unforgiving, the work still hard, the isolation still real. But they would face it together, their love a shelter stronger than any cabin walls. In the years that followed, the Davis ranch flourished. The small herd grew, the cabin expanded to a proper house, and children's laughter eventually joined the sounds of cattle and wind through the pines. Lillian's past remained behind her, buried like Caldwell in the forest of their memories, while their future unfolded with each sunrise over the Montana hills. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Declan would look at his wife, still beautiful, still strong, and remember the moment he found her lost in the pines. How holding her until she spoke had changed everything. How loving her had taught him the most important frontier lesson of all. That true courage wasn't found in facing the wilderness alone, but in opening your heart despite the risks. In the end, the love they built proved stronger than any hardship the frontier could devise. A love born in the pines, tested by fire, and destined to endure.